Just before dawn on June 6, 1944, the English Channel looked calm, too calm. A thin gray mist hovered above the water, hiding the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. Beneath that quiet surface were thousands of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, and the weight of an entire war balanced on a single morning. On the decks of Allied command ships, British generals stood in silence. They were not cheering, they were not confident, they were watching and judging. Through binoculars, they saw endless lines of American landing craft cutting through the waves. Inside those cramped boats were young men, some barely 20 years old, vomiting from fear and seasickness, clutching rifles they had never fired in real combat. And among Britain's most senior commanders, a chilling thought passed from one mind to another. This may not work. Cut to close-up, a British officer lowering binoculars, face tense. This is not the D-Day story you usually hear. History books tell us about courage, unity, and victory. They show smiling generals and triumphant headlines. But behind the polished narrative lies a far more uncomfortable truth, one rarely spoken aloud. As American troops prepared to storm the beaches of Normandy, many British generals did not believe they would succeed. Some expected horrific casualties, some feared total collapse. A few privately wondered whether the Americans were about to be destroyed in front of their eyes. And these doubts were not spoken by cowards or pessimists. They came from men who had survived Dunkirk, men who had fought Rommel in the desert, men who had spent decades studying war. Archival footage: Dunkirk evacuation, North Africa campaign. For Britain, this was not a first gamble, it was the final one. If D-Day failed, there would be no second chance, no backup invasion, no quick recovery, no way to explain to the world why tens of thousands of Allied soldiers had died on a single strip of French coast. And the Americans, new to large-scale European warfare, were being asked to carry the heaviest burden of all. Map appears, Normandy beaches highlighted. Omaha Beach, just 6 miles long, steep cliffs, concrete bunkers, veteran German troops. British intelligence officers had warned that Omaha was far more dangerous than planners initially believed, a killing ground, a nightmare for any amphibious landing. And yet, it was assigned primarily to American forces. Why? Because the invasion needed manpower on a scale Britain no longer possessed. Because the United States had the numbers, the equipment, the industrial power. But numbers do not guarantee survival. Slow zoom on young American soldiers boarding landing craft. As the invasion fleet moved closer to the French coast, British generals watched in near silence. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of Allied ground forces, paced restlessly. Known for confidence bordering on arrogance, even he understood what was at stake. General Alan Brooke, Britain's chief of the Imperial General Staff, had spent years quietly criticizing American leadership in his private diaries. He believed U.S. commanders were too aggressive, too optimistic, and dangerously inexperienced. Now the moment of truth had arrived. There would be no more arguments, no more planning conferences, no more revisions, only blood and outcome. As the first wave approached the beaches, the sky began to lighten. Some British officers expected to see chaos immediately. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing craft reached Omaha Beach. The ramps dropped, and within seconds, machine gun fire tore through the front ranks. From offshore, British naval officers could see bodies falling into the water, landing craft drifting sideways, men disappearing beneath the waves, weighed down with gear. One British observer reportedly whispered, "Dear God, they're walking straight into it." Smoke, explosions, chaos. This was not a heroic charge. It was slaughter. and from the command ships, the British generals could do nothing but watch. Reports began arriving, fragmented, confused, and horrifying, units landing far from their assigned sectors, tanks sinking before firing a single shot, officers killed before issuing orders. Within minutes, carefully prepared plans were unraveling. For British commanders trained in methodical, tightly controlled warfare, what they were witnessing looked like the beginning of a catastrophe. Alan Brooke later admitted that early messages from Omaha suggested grave danger of failure. Montgomery himself would later concede that Omaha was the one beach where the invasion nearly collapsed. At that moment, watching smoke rise from the shoreline, British generals were not thinking about victory, they were thinking about damage control. Some feared that the Americans would be pinned to the beach, unable to advance or retreat. Others worried that German counterattacks would push them back into the sea, and a few, though they never said it out loud, feared that the Americans might break, not from lack of bravery, but from sheer overwhelming force. This fear was rooted in history. Britain had seen what happened when inexperienced armies faced prepared defenses. They had seen it in 1915 at Gallipoli, a disastrous amphibious assault that haunted British military thinking for decades. Now, watching Omaha, old nightmares resurfaced. The irony was brutal. Britain, the older and more cautious ally, was watching the younger and more aggressive one gamble everything, and the cost was becoming visible in real time. Yet even as despair crept into Allied command ships, something subtle began to shift. Through smoke and confusion, British observers noticed movement, not organized waves, not textbook maneuvers, but individuals, small groups of American soldiers crawling forward, men using shell craters as cover, others climbing cliffs no one was supposed to climb. There were no clear orders, no visible coordination, just momentum, and that confused the British observers almost as much as the initial disaster. One British officer later recalled thinking, "This should not be possible, and yet they are still moving." At that moment, the British generals realized something unsettling. They had misjudged what kind of army they were watching. This was not the rigid, inexperienced force they had quietly doubted. This was something else, something unpredictable, something dangerous to the enemy. But at dawn on D-Day, no one knew how the story would end. From the decks of their ships, British generals continued to watch American troops fight their way onto the beaches of Normandy, not knowing if they were witnessing the birth of victory or the beginning of one of the greatest disasters in military history. By the beginning of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its most dangerous and decisive phase, and no nation felt this pressure more deeply than Britain, which had been fighting almost continuously since September 1939 and had already paid an enormous price in blood, cities, and confidence. Because long before American soldiers ever set foot in England, British troops had already experienced the collapse of France, the desperate evacuation at Dunkirk, and the terrifying months of the Blitz, when German bombers turned London and other cities into burning targets night after night, experiences that permanently shaped the mindset of Britain's senior military leadership, turning them into men who distrusted bold promises and who believed that survival in modern war depended on caution, preparation, and painful lessons learned the hard way. When the United States officially entered the war after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, British leaders publicly welcomed America as the decisive partner who could tip the balance. Yet behind closed doors, many senior officers harbored serious doubts about American military culture. Because the U.S. Army was massive, well-funded, and technologically advanced, but largely untested in the type of industrialized, large-scale land warfare that Germany had perfected in Europe, and as American units began arriving in Britain in growing numbers throughout 1942 and 1943, British officers could not help but notice how young many of these soldiers were, how confident they appeared, and how little real combat experience they possessed, a contrast that fed a quiet but persistent belief among British commanders that American enthusiasm might not survive first contact with a hardened enemy. These doubts were not merely casual prejudices, but were recorded in private documents, most notably in the diaries of Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, who frequently criticized American generals for what he saw as a dangerous tendency towards speed and aggression, arguing that U.S. commanders underestimated the complexity of fighting German forces and relied too heavily on overwhelming material superiority to compensate for tactical risk, while British doctrine, shaped by years of survival against a powerful enemy, emphasized deliberate planning, careful coordination, and minimizing unnecessary losses, even if that meant slower advances. This philosophical divide became increasingly visible during Allied planning conferences, where American officers pushed for rapid, decisive action, while British leaders urged caution, fearing that a single catastrophic failure could destroy the alliance and prolong the war indefinitely. Yet, despite these disagreements, strategic reality left Britain with no alternative but to place enormous responsibility in American hands, because by 1944, the British Empire was exhausted, its manpower reserves shrinking, and its economy stretched thin, while the United States could field fresh divisions, endless supplies, and an industrial output so vast that it dwarfed that of all other Allied nations combined, making American participation not just helpful, but absolutely essential for any attempt to liberate Western Europe. This necessity gave birth to Operation Overlord, a plan of unprecedented scale and complexity that aimed to land more than 156,000 Allied soldiers on the coast of Normandy on a single day, supported by over 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and years of deception operations designed to convince Germany that the invasion would strike elsewhere. And within this vast plan, the American role was particularly heavy, as U.S. forces were assigned 2 of the 5 invasion beaches, Utah and Omaha, along with the responsibility of dropping airborne divisions deep behind enemy lines during the night before the landings, tasks that demanded flexibility, initiative, and resilience under extreme pressure. On paper, the distribution of forces appeared balanced, with British and Canadian troops landing on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, areas that, while still dangerous, were considered more manageable due to terrain and intelligence assessments. But Omaha Beach stood apart as the greatest source of anxiety among planners, because reconnaissance and last-minute intelligence reports indicated that German defenses there were far stronger than initially believed, reinforced by elements of the veteran 352nd Infantry Division, whose soldiers were experienced, well-positioned, and determined, occupying concrete bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions atop steep bluffs that overlooked narrow stretches of sand, creating overlapping fields of machine gun and artillery fire that could devastate any force attempting to cross the beach. And although Allied planners increased naval bombardment and adjusted aerial bombing schedules in an effort to soften these defenses, many British intelligence officers privately doubted that such measures would be sufficient, especially given the limitations of accuracy under combat conditions and the risk that bombers might miss their targets entirely, a fear that only grew stronger as poor weather swept across the English Channel in early June, delaying the invasion by 24 hours and adding further uncertainty to an already fragile plan. This delay intensified anxiety at Allied headquarters, because prolonged waiting exhausted troops crammed into landing craft, increased the risk of German detection, and amplified the sense that the entire operation rested on variables beyond human control. And as meteorologists finally gave a narrow window of acceptable weather for June 6, 1944, British generals faced the ultimate decision, knowing that postponement could push the invasion back by weeks, while proceeding carried enormous risk. And when the order was finally given, the Armada departed southern England on the night of June 5 in near silence, thousands of ships stretching across the dark sea in a sight so vast that many British officers later described it as both awe-inspiring and terrifying, because they understood that once the first American soldier stepped onto the beaches of Normandy, there would be no easy retreat, no graceful exit, and no way to conceal failure from the world, as defeat would not only only cost tens of thousands of lives but could shatter Allied unity, embolden German resistance, and condemn Europe to years of continued occupation, a prospect that haunted Britain's leadership in particular, because the nation had already endured so much and could not afford another strategic disaster. And so, as dawn approached and the shadowy outline of the French coastline emerged through mist and smoke, British generals stood aboard command ships and inside fortified headquarters with maps clenched in their hands, burdened by memories of past failures such as Gallipoli and the Somme, uncertain faith in their American allies, and the chilling knowledge that history was about to pass judgment, because within hours the doubts they had whispered in private for years would either be confirmed in blood or erased forever by what happened on the sands of Normandy. As the first gray light of June 6, 1944 spread across the English Channel, the illusion of control vanished almost instantly, because when the American assault waves finally neared the shores of Normandy, especially at Omaha Beach, the carefully scripted plan collapsed under the weight of reality, and from the decks of British command ships positioned offshore, senior generals watched through binoculars as the sea erupted into chaos, landing craft thrown off course by rough waves and thick smoke, soldiers vomiting, praying, gripping weapons with white knuckles, many already soaked before they ever reached land, and when the ramps finally dropped at approximately 6:30 a.m., the response from German defenses was immediate and devastating, as machine gun fire tore across the open beaches, mortars slammed into the surf, and artillery shells exploded among tightly packed troops, creating scenes so violent that even seasoned British officers, men who had witnessed years of warfare, were momentarily stunned, because entire American squads were cut down within seconds, bodies collapsing into shallow water, equipment dragging them under, and landing craft drifting aimlessly after their crews were killed or wounded. From a British perspective, this was exactly the nightmare scenario amphibious doctrine warned against, a frontal assault against elevated, fortified positions where attackers had nowhere to hide, and early radio reports reaching Allied headquarters only reinforced this fear, describing units landing far from their intended sectors, officers killed before issuing orders, tanks sinking after being launched too far offshore, and infantry pinned helplessly against the seawall with no clear path forward or backward, prompting grim exchanges among British commanders who quietly questioned whether Omaha Beach could be held at all, let alone broken through, as some officers reportedly began discussing contingency plans that only hours earlier would have been unthinkable, including the possibility that parts of the American assault might have to be abandoned to prevent total annihilation. What British generals could not see clearly through the smoke and distance, however, was the fragmented, brutal reality unfolding on the sand itself, where American soldiers, many terrified, many wounded, many leaderless, were forced to make instant decisions without guidance, because radios were destroyed, officers were dead, and prearranged plans were meaningless. And yet it was precisely this breakdown of structure that produced something unexpected, as small groups of soldiers began acting independently, crawling forward inch by inch, using shell craters, drowned bodies, and twisted metal as cover, some cutting through barbed wire under fire, others scaling the bluffs along routes German defenders believed impossible, and while British observers initially interpreted the scattered movement as disorganization, they slowly realized that these isolated actions were beginning to have cumulative effects, because German firing positions that had dominated the beach moments earlier were suddenly being attacked from unexpected angles, grenades thrown into bunkers from the rear, machine gun nests silenced one by one, and gaps appearing where no gaps were supposed to exist. From offshore, British naval officers began receiving reports that contradicted the earlier despair, fragments of messages suggesting that elements of the American infantry had reached the top of the bluffs, a development so improbable that some staff officers initially questioned its accuracy. Yet as minutes turned into hours, the evidence grew impossible to ignore, because German fire along certain sectors sectors weakened, smoke cleared to reveal American figures advancing inland, and naval gunfire spotters adjusted their targets based on requests coming directly from small units that had somehow survived the initial slaughter, demonstrating a level of adaptability that British commanders had not fully anticipated. Within British headquarters, reactions shifted from shock to disbelief, as officers who had expected the Americans to be broken against the shoreline now watched them claw their way forward through sheer determination rather than coordination, and this forced an uncomfortable reassessment of long-held assumptions about American soldiers, because what was unfolding at Omaha was not a triumph of planning or doctrine, but a raw demonstration of resilience under the worst possible conditions, something British generals understood all too well, having seen similar moments during Britain's own darkest hours earlier in the war. Still, the situation remained perilous throughout the morning, as German counterattacks threatened to exploit the Americans' disorganization, and British commanders knew that a single coordinated push by German reserves could still drive the invaders back into the sea, a fear heightened by the fact that Omaha's progress lagged dangerously behind schedule compared to other beaches, raising concerns that the entire Allied front could become uneven and vulnerable. Yet even as these worries dominated command discussions, the Americans continued advancing in small, brutal increments, often without knowing what neighboring units were doing, driven less by orders than by a simple instinct to move forward or die where they lay. And this persistence gradually transformed the battlefield, because by early afternoon a tenuous but real foothold existed on Omaha, with American troops pushing inland, linking up fragmented units, and beginning to secure exits from the beach, developments that British generals observed with growing astonishment as updated situation maps showed what hours earlier had seemed impossible. For many British officers, the emotional impact of this moment was profound, because they had fully prepared themselves for catastrophic failure and were now forced to confront the reality that the Americans, whom they had quietly doubted, had endured one of the most savage tests of infantry combat ever recorded and emerged battered but unbroken. And while no one celebrated, no one cheered, there was a subtle shift in tone aboard the command ships, a sense that history had tilted away from disaster and toward possibility, even though the cost was already horrific and the day far from over. And as the afternoon wore on and reports confirmed that Omaha Beach would not be abandoned, British generals understood that they were witnessing not merely a tactical success, but a defining moment in Allied warfare, one that would reshape perceptions, alliances, and command relationships, because the Americans had done what doctrine said should not be possible, surviving an assault that should have failed, adapting under fire without centralized control, and proving through action rather than argument that they possessed the resilience required to carry the war forward, a realization that settled heavily over British headquarters as the smoke drifted inland and the sound of battle continued, because although the invasion was not yet won, one truth had become impossible to deny: the American troops on the beaches of Normandy had changed the course of the war and the way Britain's generals saw them forever. As the violence of the first hours of D-Day began to recede into a brutal rhythm of consolidation and counterfire, a deeper and far more unsettling realization took hold inside British command circles, because the true shock of June 6, 1944, was not simply that the American landings had succeeded at all, but that they had succeeded in a way that contradicted nearly every assumption British generals had carried into the invasion, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truth that the very characteristics they had long criticized in American forces, aggression, decentralization, and a willingness to act without perfect information, had become the decisive factors preventing catastrophic failure at Omaha Beach. In the days and weeks after the landings, British headquarters pored over after-action reports, battlefield maps and fragmented radio transcripts, and what emerged was not a story of flawless coordination, but one of near total systemic breakdown followed by human improvisation, because artillery bombardments had missed many German positions, airborne drops had scattered units miles from their targets, naval gunfire had struggled to suppress entrenched bunkers, and command and control structures had collapsed almost immediately under enemy fire, leaving American units isolated, leaderless, and facing one of the most lethal defensive systems ever constructed. And yet, rather than freezing or retreating, American soldiers adapted instinctively, forming temporary groups based on whoever happened to be alive nearby, sharing ammunition, exchanging shouted instructions, and advancing whenever even the smallest opportunity appeared, a pattern that British generals initially found alarming because it violated principles of order and hierarchy ingrained through decades of military tradition, but which gradually revealed itself as the only viable response to the chaos of Omaha. British officers were particularly struck by how authority flowed downward in the absence of formal leadership, as sergeants, corporals, and even privates assumed command roles without hesitation, directing assaults on machine gun nests, organizing movements across open sand, and making tactical decisions that normally would have required higher approval. And this phenomenon forced British planners to acknowledge that American military culture, often dismissed as informal or undisciplined, had fostered a kind of battlefield adaptability that proved invaluable when conventional plans disintegrated, a realization that challenged the British belief that success depended primarily on centralized control and meticulous synchronization. As reports continued to arrive, British generals also confronted another uncomfortable truth, namely that Omaha Beach had come perilously close to complete failure, far closer than the public would ever be told, because internal communications revealed moments when senior Allied officers seriously contemplated halting further landings or redirecting reinforcements to other beaches, fearing that continued assaults might simply add to the slaughter without achieving a breakthrough. And while such measures were never fully implemented, the mere fact that they were discussed underscored how thin the margin between victory and disaster truly was, a margin crossed not by superior planning, but by the relentless determination of American infantry who refused to accept the logic of defeat. This realization carried profound implications for Allied strategy moving forward, because it suggested that future operations would likely hinge less on perfect execution and more on the ability of frontline units to adapt rapidly under extreme stress, a lesson that British commanders absorbed with a mixture of admiration and unease, knowing that it demanded a shift in mindset as well as tactics. Beyond the operational lessons, the events of Omaha forced a reassessment of Allied leadership dynamics, because while Britain had entered the war years earlier and borne the burden of resistance during its darkest period, D-Day demonstrated that the scale and momentum of the final campaign would inevitably be driven by American power, not only in terms of manpower and industrial capacity, but also in terms of operational philosophy, as U.S. forces proved capable of sustaining heavy losses while continuing to press forward, a reality that subtly but decisively altered the balance of influence within the alliance, prompting British generals to recognize that their role was evolving from primary architects to experienced partners in a coalition increasingly defined by American initiative. This shift was not without emotional weight, because many British officers had devoted their careers to defending the empire and leading its armies, and the acknowledgement that strategic leadership was passing to a younger ally carried elements of pride, relief, and quiet resignation, all intensified by the knowledge that this transition had been sealed by American blood on the beaches of Normandy. Privately, British generals began to speak more openly about their pre-invasion doubts, admitting in diaries and confidential conversations that they had expected the American assault at Omaha to stall completely or even collapse under the weight of German defenses, an expectation shaped not by contempt for American courage, but by a sober assessment of the terrain, the fortifications, and the unforgiving nature of amphibious warfare. And these admissions, recorded after the fact, revealed the depth of the psychological shift that D-Day produced, because the Americans had not merely met expectations, but shattered them by succeeding where seasoned professionals believed success was nearly impossible. The twist of D-Day, therefore, lay not in a dramatic reversal of fortune, but in a gradual, dawning realization among British commanders that modern war rewarded flexibility, initiative, and resilience as much as it rewarded planning and discipline, a realization reinforced by the observation that German defenses, though formidable, were ultimately overwhelmed not by superior firepower alone, but by the cumulative effect of countless small actions carried out by individuals who refused to remain pinned down, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the Normandy campaign as American forces pushed inland, exploiting gaps, bypassing strong points, and maintaining relentless pressure even when coordination faltered. As the days passed and the beachhead expanded, British generals also became increasingly aware of how the narrative of D-Day would be shaped for public consumption, emphasizing unity, heroism, and inevitability, while downplaying the moments of near failure and internal doubt that had characterized the operation's earliest hours. And while they understood the necessity of this narrative for morale and political stability, they privately recognized that the true lesson of Omaha lay in its unpredictability and the dangers of overconfidence, lessons that would influence planning for subsequent operations, even as they remained absent from official histories. This tension between public narrative and private understanding added another layer to the twist of D-Day, because British commanders found themselves carrying a truth that could not be fully expressed, namely that the invasion's success depended as much on chance and human resilience as on strategy, and that a slightly different alignment of circumstances could have produced a vastly different outcome. A sobering thought that reinforced their respect for the American soldiers who had endured the worst of the fighting without knowing how close their sacrifice came to being overwhelmed by events beyond their control. In the end, the unexpected turn of D-Day was not a single revelation, but a cascade of realizations that reshaped British perceptions at every level, from tactical doctrine to alliance politics, from assumptions about leadership to beliefs about courage and endurance, because the Americans had proved themselves not by executing a flawless plan, but by surviving the collapse of that plan and creating success out of chaos. And this forced British generals to accept that the future of the war and the future of warfare itself belonged to armies capable of absorbing shock, decentralizing decision-making, and pushing forward even when logic suggested retreat, a lesson etched into memory by the sight of American troops advancing inland from a beach that only hours earlier had seemed destined to become a graveyard. And as the guns fell silent and the maps filled with new lines marking Allied progress, British commanders understood that D-Day had altered more than the course of the war. It had altered their understanding of what victory required, leaving them with a mixture of humility, respect, and an unspoken acknowledgement that history had just passed judgment on assumptions they had carried for years. As darkness finally settled over the coast of Normandy on the night of June 6, 1944, the beaches that had shaken the world only hours earlier fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by distant artillery and the soft rhythm of waves moving in and out, washing over blood-stained sand, twisted steel, and the bodies of men who would never see another sunrise. And it was in this heavy, almost sacred quiet that British generals truly began to understand what they had witnessed. because the invasion was no longer a moving picture viewed through binoculars or maps marked with uncertain symbols, but a reality etched permanently into memory, as casualty figures filtered in with brutal clarity, revealing that thousands of American soldiers lay dead or wounded, many killed in the first terrifying minutes of the assault. Yet despite losses that bordered on unimaginable, the Allied foothold in France remained intact, fragile but unbroken, and this single fact carried more weight than any speech or communique could ever convey. Inside British command posts, officers sat exhausted, uniforms stiff with salt and sweat, staring at situation maps that now showed solid lines where hours earlier there had been only question marks. And in those moments, far from the cheers of victory or the rhetoric of unity, many British generals confronted a truth they had not expected to face, that the men they had quietly doubted, the American soldiers they feared might collapse under fire, had instead absorbed the worst blow of the war in Western Europe and refused to yield, altering the course of history through endurance rather than elegance. Diaries written that night and in the days that followed reveal not triumph but humility, as senior British officers acknowledged, often with striking honesty, that they had anticipated far greater failure, that they had prepared themselves mentally for evacuation orders, for strategic disaster, and even for the possibility that the invasion might have to be explained to the world as a necessary but tragic gamble that did not succeed. And it was precisely this contrast between expectation and outcome that left such a lasting imprint on British military thinking, because what unfolded at Omaha Beach defied not only German defenses, but decades of accumulated doctrine, showing that under the most extreme conditions, human will could compensate for broken plans, flawed intelligence, and catastrophic loss. As British generals reviewed reports describing how American soldiers fought on without officers, without radios, and often without hope of reinforcement, they began to see D-Day not merely as a logistical achievement or strategic turning point, but as a moral one, a moment when the psychological balance of the war shifted irreversibly, because Germany could now be beaten not just through attrition or air power, but through the sustained pressure of an army willing to endure unimaginable punishment and continue advancing. And this realization brought with it a quiet sense of relief for Britain, which had carried the burden of resistance alone for so long, and now understood that the final defeat of Nazi Germany would not rest on British shoulders alone. Yet this relief was inseparable from grief, because British officers were acutely aware that the price of this new confidence had been paid primarily by American lives, young men who had crossed an ocean to die on foreign sand, and many British commanders later admitted that this knowledge deepened their respect for American sacrifice in a way that no joint planning conference ever could, forging a bond not of rhetoric but of shared bloodshed. In the weeks that followed, as Allied forces pushed inland and the Normandy campaign ground forward through hedgerows and villages, British generals continued to reflect on the first day of the invasion, recognizing that D-Day had reshaped the alliance itself, subtly but decisively shifting operational momentum toward American leadership, not because Britain had failed, but because the scale, resilience, and adaptability demonstrated by U.S. forces made it clear that the war's final phase would be driven by American power, a transition that carried emotional weight for a nation that had once stood as the last barrier against Hitler, yet also offered the reassurance that the final defeat of Nazi Germany would not rest on British shoulders alone. Yet this relief was inseparable from grief, because British officers were acutely aware that the price of this new confidence had been paid primarily by American lives, young men who had crossed an ocean to die on foreign sand, and many British commanders later admitted that this knowledge deepened their respect for American sacrifice in a way that no joint planning conference ever could, forging a bond not of rhetoric but of shared bloodshed. In the weeks that followed, as Allied forces pushed inland and the Normandy campaign ground forward through hedgerows and villages, British generals continued to reflect on the first day of the invasion, recognizing that D-Day had reshaped the alliance itself, subtly but decisively shifting operational momentum toward American leadership, not because Britain had failed, but because the scale, resilience, and adaptability demonstrated by U.S. forces made it clear that the war's final phase would be driven by American power, a transition that carried emotional weight for a nation that had once stood as the last barrier against Hitler, yet also offered the reassurance that the final defeat of Nazi Germany would not rest on British shoulders alone. Yet this relief was inseparable from grief, because British officers were acutely aware that the price of this new confidence had been paid primarily by American lives, young men who had crossed an ocean to die on foreign sand, and many British commanders later admitted that this knowledge deepened their respect for American sacrifice in a way that no joint planning conference ever could, forging a bond not of rhetoric but of shared bloodshed. In the weeks that followed, as Allied forces pushed inland and the Normandy campaign ground forward through hedgerows and villages, British generals continued to reflect on the first day of the invasion, recognizing that D-Day had reshaped the alliance itself, subtly but decisively shifting operational momentum toward American leadership, not because Britain had failed, but because the scale, resilience, and adaptability demonstrated by U.S. forces made it clear that the war's final phase would be driven by American power, a transition that carried emotional weight for a nation that had once stood as the last barrier against Hitler, yet also offered the reassurance that the final defeat of Nazi Germany would not rest on British shoulders alone. Yet this relief was inseparable from grief, because British officers were acutely aware that the price of this new confidence had been paid primarily by American lives, young men who had crossed an ocean to die on foreign sand, and many British commanders later admitted that this knowledge deepened their respect for American sacrifice in a way that no joint planning conference ever could, forging a bond not of rhetoric but of shared bloodshed. In the weeks that followed, as Allied forces pushed inland and the Normandy campaign ground forward through hedgerows and villages, British generals continued to reflect on the first day of the invasion, recognizing that D-Day had reshaped the alliance itself, subtly but decisively shifting operational momentum toward American leadership, not because Britain had failed, but because the scale, resilience, and adaptability demonstrated by U.S. forces made it clear that the war's final phase would be driven by American power, a transition that carried emotional weight for a nation that had once stood as the last barrier against Hitler, yet also offered the reassurance that the final defeat of Nazi Germany would not rest on British shoulders alone. Yet this relief was inseparable from grief, because British officers were acutely aware that the price of this new confidence had been paid primarily by American lives, young men who had crossed an ocean to die on foreign sand, and many British commanders later admitted that this knowledge deepened their respect for American sacrifice in a way that no joint planning conference ever could, forging a bond not of rhetoric but of shared bloodshed. In the weeks that followed, as Allied forces pushed inland and the Normandy campaign ground forward through hedgerows and villages, British generals continued to reflect on the first day of the invasion, recognizing that D-Day had reshaped the alliance itself, subtly but decisively shifting operational momentum toward American leadership, not because Britain had failed, but because the scale, resilience, and adaptability demonstrated by U.S. forces made it clear that the war's final phase would be driven by American power, a transition that carried emotional weight for a nation that had once stood as the last barrier against Hitler, yet also offered the reassurance that the final defeat of Nazi Germany would not rest on British shoulders alone. Yet this relief was inseparable from grief, because British officers were acutely aware that the price of this new confidence had been paid primarily by American lives, young men who had crossed an ocean to die on foreign sand, and many British commanders later admitted that this knowledge deepened their respect for American sacrifice in a way that no joint planning conference ever could, forging a bond not of rhetoric but of shared bloodshed. In the weeks that followed, as Allied forces pushed inland and the Normandy campaign ground forward through